Hello, my name is Agata Paszka and I am a graduate student of philosophy at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. It is my utmost pleasure to present to you this series of interviews with Professor Michael Devitt, a distinguished professor of philosophy at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Over the years, Professor Devitt has published numerous books and articles, most notably on issues in philosophy of language, metaphysics, and philosophy of biology. These interviews, conducted during Professor Devitt's visit to Krakow in November 2024, center around three topics. The first one concerns Professor Devitt's philosophical development and the origins of his ideas, beginning with some early reflections from the time preceding his post-secondary education, for undergraduate and graduate training, all the way to the early period of his career which followed the completion of his PhD studies at Harvard University. The second topic concerns realism and naturalism, two guiding principles not just of Professor Devitt's metaphysics, but of the entirety of his philosophical thought. Issues concerning language, broadly construed, constitute the third topic. By discussing some of these key themes from Professor Devitt's philosophy, we strove to connect his ideas regarding many philosophical problems, often seemingly far removed from one another, whilst also acknowledging the crucial changes which occurred between his subsequent theoretical proposals. Without further ado, here's our conversation. Enjoy. I'm curious about your interest in philosophy of biology. How did that come about?
Yes. Well, there's a sense in which I've always been interested in it, but I never pursued the interest until about 15 years ago. Interest in the philosophy of biology is very strong in Australia, and two of my former students are eminent philosophers of biology, Kim Strelny and Peter Godfrey Smith, and I've always found it, I'm just generally interested in the philosophy of science, and I've always found it interesting. I would always attend philosophy of biology talks at conferences, but it was really very much on the side for me. My engagement in it, serious engagement of it, began when I was working on an issue in the philosophy of language, which was the issue of rigidity. Kripke introduced this notion of rigid designation, which he defined for singular terms. And then he went on to discuss other sorts of terms, which he called natural kind terms, and he, including terms like gold and water and tiger and so on, and he said that a lot of what he said about proper names could be carried over to what he's now saying. In particular, he had in mind anti-descriptivism and some sort of causal historical theory involving reference borrowing and so on. But part of what he said that could be carried over was rigidity. And this was a bit puzzling because he didn't define a new notion of rigidity that applied to these natural kind terms. And this created a lot of concern in the business. How can we extend rigidity, rigid designation to these other sorts of terms? And I was drawn into this by blind reviewing some papers for, I think, Phil Studies. And this led me, just thinking about what I was saying and reviewing these papers, led me to want to write an article about rigidity applied to these terms. And I said that, look, the idea of rigid designation is not the rigidity, the sort of idea that we want when we move to natural kind terms. rigid designation is defined as a relationship between a word and a single object, whereas it seemed to me the sort of notion we needed in semantics, the notion of rigidity for these natural kind terms, was a relationship between a term and a whole lot of objects, if it's a count noun like tiger. So I proposed the idea of rigid application. A term rigidly applies to something. Should it apply to something in one world, it will apply to that thing in any other possible world in which that object exists. And I said this was really the sort of notion of rigidity that Saul should have had in mind anyway, and that it would do the work that Saul wanted rigidity to do. And the work that he wanted to do, I argued, was to help refute description theories. That's what he used rigid designation for, and I said rigid application would do the same job for these natural kind terms. So what's all that got to do with biology? Well, I discovered, of course, when applying this theory of rigid application to a term like tiger, it had the consequence that it had essentialist consequences. If the word tiger is a rigid applier, it has the consequence that tigers must have some essence, and including apparently an intrinsic essence, or particularly an intrinsic essence, which of course is what Saul had thought it had anyway. So that was my route in. Before I submitted the paper, given this consequence, I was a bit worried. So I seem to be committed to this sort of essentialism, and I better find out what people think about it. Mm-hmm. I read a wonderful article by Samir Okasha, where he presents the received view in the philosophy of biology, and to a certain extent he was suggesting in biology. And the received view was totally hostile to this idea of intrinsic essence. The received view was that the essence of a taxon like tiger, and all taxa, but the taxon like tiger, was not anything intrinsic, and in fact, to suppose it was anything intrinsic is really contrary to Darwin, not the sort of thing anyone who knows anything about biology would propose. And people who understand biology will urge, particularly evolutionary biology, should urge the view that the essence of a taxon like tiger is a certain matter of history. As he, I think, put it, and certainly others have put it, what is it to be a tiger? It's to occupy a certain segment of the tree of life. So that's what he said in this paper, and I thought, wow, that seems to me to be all wrong. I thought that these taxa had to have intrinsic essences. Of course, I was sort of committed to that by my rigid application story, but I thought, and so that set me to work, and I set out my thoughts on this in a paper, not a paper, some notes, which I called Heretical Thoughts on Biological Essentialism or something like that. So that's how it all started.
So the motivation was actually coming from semantics. Right. It started with work in philosophy of language. And,
no, it wasn't the motivation. Not in any really strong sense. It was certainly the philosophy of biology, the philosophy of language, the semantic stuff, which drew my attention to Samir's paper.
Okay.
But once my attention was drawn to it, and that paper, by the way, not only deals with the metaphysical issues, but also has something to say about the semantics.
Right.
As soon as my attention was drawn to it, it was Samir's paper presenting what he rightly thought was a consensus view. That's what really stimulated me, because I thought, wow, the consensus view seems to me all wrong.
So you quickly went back to your put metaphysics first approach in this sense.
Well, I just was stimulated, as I said, to write these heretical thoughts.
Right. So let's zone in on intrinsic essences, because it's a very controversial view for many philosophers of biology and many metaphysicians as well. Why do you presume this is so?
Right. Yes. So look, what happened, I said I wrote these heretical thoughts, and in these heretical thoughts, I presented what I thought was the argument for the intrinsic essences, and it was an argument that welled out of me immediately when I read what Samir Okocha had to say. The argument really is quite simple. We need to explain the phenotypical, the standard phenotypical properties of taxa. So take tigers, right? And let's take something very simple. Tigers are striped. We need an answer to the question in virtue of what they are striped. This is not a brute fact of the world. What explains how do they come to be striped? And what I said was that the only way to explain this, it has to be something about the nature of the tigers that makes them striped and in their environment. And that something that does the explanatory work has to be something intrinsic. So that was it. That was a core idea in my heretical thoughts. My heretical thoughts went for about 7 pages, and I got an absolutely astonishingly generous response from the philosophers of biology, because I sent it around to a lot of people. And they replied to me, and they straightened me out on various things. They drew my attention to a whole lot of things I needed to have my attention drawn to. Wonderfully helpful. And a number of them, of course, objected to my main thing, but I wasn't convinced by any of the objections to my main argument. So I came out of this thinking, oh my God, there's lots more I've got to learn, but it looks to me as if my main argument is still intact. And I had something like 100 pages of email exchanges with everyone, and that led me off, and I tried to then, I set about educating myself along the lines that they had advised me, and before long, I had an article, and then another article, and so on, and now I've got a book, yes. Yeah. But my view became a little bit more complicated, but that's the basic. I don't know whether you want me to mention the complications, but.
Absolutely, because in the book you urge a very extensive view of biological essentialism, individual essences, racial essentialism towards the very end, the last chapter. So these are, well, I guess even more controversial topics when it comes to essentialism. So could you perhaps say something more about that? How is the response to those chapters? What was the response?
Well, the response is, there's been a lot of response. And in my book, I respond to a lot of the criticism. But the basic argument seems to me to have held up. It's this argument about explanation. The guiding idea for me, and this was something in my mind long before I got into this, was that kinds have natures, and natures explain underlying natures or essences. I mean, essence has got this slightly medieval sound to it, or as a term, but I use it because, in fact, it is commonly used here. But you can talk about the nature of a taxon, or you can even call it the identity of a taxon, or the essence. It doesn't matter what you call it. There is some underlying aspect of a kind which explains its phenotypical properties in the environment. Indian rhinos have one horn. African rhinos have two horns. What explains this? It's not the environment. It's not the different environment in India from Africa. What explains it is underlying intrinsic differences. That's how it comes about that the little rhino grows to have two horns if it's in Africa, and in one horn if it's in India. So that was the guiding idea. But the picture is a little bit more complicated. I mentioned that Samir rightly pointed out the consensus view is that the essence is to be found in the history. My view is more complicated in that I don't reject the idea that part of the essence is historical. I simply want to insist against the consensus that part of it is intrinsic. So I think there's a part intrinsic, part historical part of the essence. And this accommodates the fact that there are two sorts of explanations we need to give about a taxon. We need to give an explanation, a developmental explanation. How does it come about that the embryonic Indian rhino develops to have one horn, and the embryonic African rhino to have two horns? How does that come about? That's where you need something intrinsic to give you a developmental explanation. But there is also a historical thing that we need to explain. The hot historical question. How did it come about that there are organisms, rhino-like organisms, with the properties of a rhino, including, let's say, in the case of the African rhino, two horns? How did that come about? This is asking you an explanation of how it evolved, that there are these something. How did it come about that that pandas have thumbs? Very unusual property in a bear. To explain that, we have to say something about the nature, the nature of the panda, and in the former case, the rhino. It's because they have a certain history. That's essential to them, their history, that they are the way they are. So historical explanations, or if you like, evolutionary explanations, require a partly historical essence, and the developmental explanations require an intrinsic essence. So I have I'm partly with the consensus and partly against it in that respect. And that's the sort of template I use when it comes to individual essentialism. So in my book, I argue for intrinsic, partly intrinsic. I argue for partly historical. And I do the same thing with individuals. How does it come about that this particular tiger, what has Benji, let's call him, has stripes? Well, you've got You need a developmental explanation, and you need an evolutionary explanation, and we need to posit a partly intrinsic, partly historical essence to Benjy. That's the individual essence. Biologists, philosophers of biology, have mostly not expressed opinions about the intrinsic essence of an individual, the essence of an individual. So here I was sort of off doing things. I wasn't at odds with what people were doing because they weren't doing it. But I did develop this view. Not that people had said nothing, but until recently they hadn't. What they said was people had argued against the idea that an individual was a member of a certain taxon, was essentially a member. Well, I said part of their essence was that they were essential. But that's just part of the general argument for part intrinsic, part historical essence for individuals. Yes, so that's the way it went. Always the emphasis is always on explanation. Now let me just, before dropping off, this is a very old idea about essences and natures. I'm told, I'm no scholar, that it goes back to Aristotle, that essences or natures explain the observable properties of the entity in the environment. You always got to feed in the environment. Change the environment enough and you won't get the observable properties. Change the environment enough and you could probably make it the case that an African rhino did not have two horns. But in a certain environment, what causes them to have two horns in the environment they're in is something about their nature. And this is quite a general Aristotelian idea. Though I didn't know that, but it's certainly an idea I embraced. And this is a reason, why bother to talk about essences? This is one response you get from philosophers of biology. Well, the answer is because natures are what explains the way things are.
So one could argue that, well, this is a fairly new interest of yours, but I think it ties up nicely with what we talked about before, scientific realism, because you mentioned it quite a few times, especially in the past few minutes, that you want to explain something you observe, right? Yes. Like the stripes of a tiger, for instance.
Yes.
And this is just like the basic argument that you urge for scientific realism. So actually there is a sort of continuity in your line of thought.
Right. Well, this is an example of, I mean, in the basic argument is for realism rests on the idea that theories that posit, we should believe in the truth of theories that posit unobservables, because those unobservables, existing as they do with the natures they have according to the theory, explain the observed phenomena. What you see me doing in arguing for biological essentialism is an example of this. I'm saying biological theories are committed to the existence of certain underlying properties, underlying entities with underlying properties. Yeah, that's just an example. That's right.
So we're back to where we started from, right? So naturalism.
Well, that sounds a bit depressing.
Well, no, not in a bad sense. It's just that it's, you know, you're pushing it further. You know, the same important.
Well, it's always a drive for explanation. Yes, and I see. That's not uncontroversial, of course. But for realists about science, scientific realists, we all love explanation.
And again, we're back to that curiosity that we talked about in the first interview. So the sort of the driving force
Yes.
behind your realism.
To
really.
understand things, yes.
Yeah, to
explain
understand
them.
things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. You don't just want a theory that captures the observable phenomena. You want something that explains the observable phenomena. That's the key thing.